This lecture is World War I. On the left side of this title slide, you see, of course, a newspaper proclaiming the news that the U.S. was at war with Germany. Congress had declared war. This is in 1917. The president had signed the resolution. Very famous sort of use of patriotism and government propaganda on the newspaper there. Okay. The second thing on the right is the very famous James Flagg illustration, recruiting poster, "I want you, Uncle Sam, I want you for the U.S. Army." This had been adapted from a British recruiting poster of Lord Kitchener, the head of the army, of the British Army at the time, saying, "I want you," in exactly the same way. And one of the reasons we have Uncle Sam in our minds the way we do, in other words, this skinny sort of hatchet-faced guy, looks like a Abe Lincoln with white hair, is because Flagg used the this model for the "I want you" for the U.S. Army. So Uncle Sam is consistently portrayed in this way after World War I. You'll know by the end of this module an awful lot of things that we tie to national identity, national pride, and everything start in World War I, including things like the national anthem. So let me start off by talking like this. In 1902, W.T. Stead published a short volume with the arresting title, "The Americanization of the World, or the Trend of the 20th Century." Now, Stead predicted that the United States would soon emerge as the greatest of world powers. But what was most striking about his work was that Stead located the source of American power less in the realm of military might or territorial acquisition than in the country's single-minded commitment to the pursuit of wealth and the relentless international spread of American culture, art, music, journalism, even ideas about religion and gender relations. He foresaw a future in which the United States promoted its interests and values through an unending involvement in the affairs of other nations. And Stead, in this way, proved to be a very accurate prophet. The Spanish-American War made the United States an international empire, but compared to Europe's colonial empires, its overseas possessions were small. America's empire was not territorial so much as it was economic and cultural. At the start of the 20th century, the world's economy was already highly globalized, and although Britain still dominated the world finance and its currency dominated world trade, the United States was the leading industrial power. By 1914, the year World War I began, the United States made more than a third of the world's manufactured goods, and its steel, oil, and agricultural equipment and other consumer goods inundated European markets. Along with American goods moving to Europe were Americans, especially those from national and ethnic groups interested in the lands of their origin, such as Irish Americans supporting independence from England, American Jews opposed to religious persecution in Russia, and Black Americans hoping to uplift Africa. America's increasing economic and cultural connections with the world led to elevated American military and political involvement. Between 1900 and 1920, many of the principles that guided American foreign policy for the rest of the 20th century were formed, such as the open door policy, that American trade, investment, information, and culture should flow freely to other nations and markets. Americans discussed their foreign policy in terms of freedom. Rhetorically, this was expressed in a widespread belief that America spread its power and influence in the world not out of narrow economic or strategic interests, but to promote universal ideas of liberty and democracy. Woodrow Wilson and his policy of liberal internationalism best represented this tendency, as Wilson believed that political freedoms would follow wherever American trade and investment flowed. World War I became the test for Wilson's ideas, and the progressives who supported him and sought to make the war an opportunity to reform America and the world. Rather than bring progressivism to other peoples, the war, in fact, destroyed it at home. And now on to the rest of the lecture, narrated by Dana Flowers.
American infantry advancing with tanks near Essay. A crayon and charcoal drawing by George Matthews Harding captures the challenging conditions faced by American soldiers during World War I. An accomplished magazine illustrator, Harding was one of 8 official war artists hired by the War Department to record combat scenes. He was particularly intrigued by the new technologies of warfare, including airplanes, trucks, motorcycles, and, as in this work, the armored tank. During World War II, he again painted scenes of war, this time in the South Pacific. These are the subtopics for this lecture: an era of intervention, America and the Great War, the war at home, who is an American, 1919. Progressive-era presidents who expanded government power at home did so abroad as well. Initially, their interventions occurred in the Western Hemisphere, which the United States had made its sphere to oversee in the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Between 1901 and 1920, U.S. Marines landed in Caribbean countries more than 20 times, usually to secure a better economic environment for American companies that wanted safe access to raw materials, or bankers who wanted to ensure that loans were repaid. Roosevelt divided the world into civilized and uncivilized nations, and he believed the former were obliged to establish order in a chaotic world. Roosevelt was far more engaged in international diplomacy than his predecessors, and while he disclaimed any American interest in acquiring overseas territory, he ordered multiple interventions in Central America. His first major action was engineering the separation of Panama from Colombia in order to build a canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In 1903, when Colombia refused to cede land for the canal, Roosevelt helped to launch an uprising in Panama, and he deployed American gunboats to prevent the Colombian army from suppressing it. Having secured Panamanian independence and a treaty giving the United States the right to construct and operate a canal and sovereignty over the Panama Canal Zone, Roosevelt launched one of the greatest construction and engineering projects in history. "I took the canal zone," he later exclaimed. The project, finished in 1914, facilitated American and world trade by drastically cutting shipping times. But the canal zone would long remain a source of tension. Initiated by President Jimmy Carter in 1977, the operation of the canal zone was handed over to Panama in 2000. Roosevelt's interventionist foreign policy came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This policy expressed the right of the United States to exercise an international police power in the Western Hemisphere, allowing it not just to prevent European intervention in the Americas, as the Monroe Doctrine specified, but forcibly to intervene whenever it was deemed necessary. Roosevelt feared that financial instability in the Americas simply invited European powers to intervene whenever they felt their investments were threatened. In 1904, Roosevelt invaded the Dominican Republic to ensure that its custom houses repaid debts to European and American investors. In 1906, he sent troops to Cuba to ensure stability after a disputed election. They stayed until 1909. President Taft sent Marines to Nicaragua to protect a government friendly to American economic interests, but he emphasized economic investment and loans from banks, rather than direct military intervention, as the best means to spread American influence. This policy, known as the dollar diplomacy, took shape in Taft's efforts to shape the economies of Honduras, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and even Liberia. Constructed in the first years of the 20th century after Theodore Roosevelt helped engineer Panama's independence from Colombia, the Panama Canal drastically reduced the time it took for commercial and naval vessels to sail between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Between 1898 and 1941, the United States intervened militarily numerous times in the Caribbean countries, generally to protect the economic interests of American banks and investors. The World's Constable, a cartoon commenting on Theodore Roosevelt's new diplomacy in Judge, January 14, 1905, portrays Roosevelt as an impartial policeman, holding in one hand the threat of force and in the other the promise of the peaceful settlement of disputes. Roosevelt stands between the undisciplined, non-white peoples of the world and the imperialist powers of Europe and Japan. The highly moralistic Woodrow Wilson brought a missionary zeal and sense of his own and America's righteousness to foreign policy. He made William Jennings Bryan, an anti-imperialist, his Secretary of State, and he repudiated dollar diplomacy and promised to respect Latin American independence and free it from economic domination. But Wilson believed the United States had a duty to instruct other nations in democracy, and that American exports and investments spread American political ideals. For Wilson, American economic influence served a purpose higher than profit, and his belief made for more military interventions than any president before or since. He sent Marines to Haiti in 1915 and the Dominican Republic in 1916 to protect American financial interests. They stayed in the latter country until 1924, and in the former until 1934. Wilson's foreign policy illustrates a lasting paradox of modern American history. Presidents speaking most about freedom were likely to intervene the most in other nations' affairs. Wilson was most involved in Mexico, where a 1911 revolution led by Francisco Madero overthrew Porfirio Diaz's long-standing dictatorship. In 1913, without Wilson's knowledge, but with the support of U.S. ambassador and American companies controlling Mexico's oil and mines, the military commander Victoriano Huerta assassinated Madero and seized power. Wilson was outraged, would not extend recognition, and vowed to teach Latin Americans to elect good men. When civil war erupted and Wilson sent troops to Veracruz to prevent arms shipments, they were met as invaders and attacked by Mexican troops. In 1916, after Mexican troops led by Pancho Villa killed Americans in a New Mexico town close to the border, Wilson ordered 10,000 American troops to invade northern Mexico to apprehend Villa. Revolutionary chaos continued during the next few years, and Mexico provided a warning that it was potentially very difficult to use American power to control foreign policy. A 1915 postcard portrays two soldiers, one American, one Mexican, at the border between the two countries shortly before Woodrow Wilson ordered American troops into Mexico. The photograph is intended to show a difference in discipline between the two. In June 1914, the assassination in Bosnia of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, started a chain of events that engulfed Europe in the most devastating war the world had yet seen. European nations that were engaged in the scramble for colonies had entered into a series of alliances that sought military domination in Europe. Austria-Hungary soon declared war on Serbia. Because of the alliance system, Britain, France, Russia, and Japan soon found themselves at war with the Central Powers. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which included modern-day Turkey and much of the Middle East. After initial German victories, the war became mired in a long stalemate of bloody and indecisive battles. New technologies such as submarines, airplanes, machine guns, tanks, and poison gas produced unprecedented slaughter. In the 5-month Battle of Verdun in 1916, some 600,000 French and German soldiers died. 10 million soldiers and uncounted civilians perished in the conflict. The Great War inflicted a blow on the optimism and self-confidence of Western civilization, whose philosophers and statesmen had long celebrated reason and progress. The war also shocked the socialist and labor movements, which had valued international working-class solidarity over nationalism, only to see workers of different nations kill each other for their national governments. Americans were deeply divided over the war. Many Americans sided with Britain, associating it with liberty and democracy, and Germany with repressive and aristocratic government. Others, particularly German and Irish Americans, opposed supporting the British. Immigrants from Russia, especially Jews, also did not want America to support Russia and its Tsar, and the despotic Russia's alliance with Britain and France made it hard to believe that the war was a conflict between democracy and autocracy. Many feminists, pacifists, and social reformers believed peace was necessary for reform at home, and they opposed American involvement. Wilson at first proclaimed U.S. neutrality, but naval warfare disrupted American commerce and threatened America's neutral stance. In May 1915, German submarines sank the British liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 passengers, including 124 Americans. Wilson protested strongly, and Americans were outraged, giving support to those who urged America to prepare for war. Advocates of preparedness included Theodore Roosevelt and businessmen with ties to Britain, America's greatest trading partner and recipient of more than $2 billion in wartime loans from U.S. banks. Wilson was strongly pro-British and called Germany a natural enemy of liberty, and by the end of 1915, ordered preparedness to begin. Wilbur Wright, who with his brother Orville made the first powered flight in 1903, circling the Statue of Liberty 6 years later. World War I would reveal the military uses for this new technology. A 1916 Wilson campaign truck, a new development in political campaigning, promising peace, prosperity, and preparedness. In May 1916, Wilson's preparedness policy seemed to have worked, as Germany suspended submarine warfare against non-combatants, allowing Americans to trade and travel freely without requiring military action. "He kept us out of war," became Wilson's campaign slogan in 1916 presidential election. The Republican Party was reunited, and its candidate, Charles Evans Hughes, lost to Wilson by only a narrow margin, including the votes of women in Western states. Wilson acted quickly. On January 22, 1917, Wilson called for a peace without victory in Europe and expressed his vision of a world order including freedom of the seas, restrictions on armaments, and self-determination for all nations, large and small. Germany soon resumed its submarine warfare against ships sailing to or from Great Britain and sank several American merchant ships, gambling that it could starve Britain into submission before America intervened militarily. In March 1917, British spies made public the Zimmermann telegram, a message by the German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico, asking it to declare war against the United States and regain its territory lost in the Mexican War. A revolution in Russia that deposed the Tsar and established a constitutional republic made it seem plausible to believe that the United States would be fighting for democracy. On April 2nd, Wilson asked Congress to declare war against Germany, which it did with a small minority of dissenters, in order to make the world safe for democracy. By the spring of 1918, when American troops arrived in Europe, the Communist Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin in Russia the previous November had led to the withdrawal of Russia from the war. Lenin also exposed secret treaties by which the Allies had agreed to divide conquered territory after the war, embarrassing Wilson. In January 1918, Wilson reassured the public that the war was a righteous cause by issuing the 14 points, which stated American war aims and providing his vision of a new international order. This involved self-determination for all nations, freedom of the seas, free trade, open diplomacy, the adjustment of colonial claims with the colonized, and the establishment of a General Association of Nations to preserve peace. Wilson believed that this organization, which became the League of Nations, would act like the kinds of commissions progressives had established in America for ensuring social harmony and protecting the weak. By September, nearly 1 million Americans helped turn the tide of the war and pushed German forces in retreat, especially in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. This campaign left 100,000 American soldiers dead and wounded, and was one of the most significant and deadliest battles in American history. With his forces retreating, on November 9th, the German Kaiser abdicated the throne, and 2 days later, Germany sued for peace. over 100,000 Americans died, a number comprising only 1% of the 10 million people killed in the war. The American painter John Singer Sargent was commissioned by the British government to create a painting depicting World War I and sent to the front lines in France. The result, Gast, completed in 1919 after the war's end, was doubtless not what the authorities had in mind. Revolted by the carnage he had witnessed, Sargent painted a line of soldiers, their eyes bandaged because of the exposure to mustard gas, being led off by a medic to receive treatment. More wounded men lie in the foreground. Sargent was one of many artists and intellectuals who concluded that the war had been a ghastly mistake. After years of stalemate on the Western Front in World War I, the arrival of American troops in 1917 and 1918 shifted the balance of power and made possible the Allied victory. World War I was the first war in which soldiers moved to the battlefront in motorized trucks. This photograph is from 1918. Commenting on American intervention in the war, Randolph Bourne wrote, "War is the health of the state." Bourne saw the expansion of government power in war as a threat, but most progressives saw it as an opportunity for reforming America and spreading progressive values across the world. Virtually all progressives rallied behind Wilson and the war, including intellectuals like John Dewey, journalists Walter Lippmann and Herbert Croly, and Samuel Gompers, president of the American Federation of Labor, AFL, to name a few. Dewey told progressives to recognize the social possibilities of the war. The war created a national government with unprecedented power and an increased presence in Americans' lives. With the Selective Service Act of May 1918, 24 million men had to register for the draft, and the Army grew from 120,000 to 5 million men. New federal agencies were created to regulate industry, transportation, labor relations, and agriculture. A War Industries Board oversaw all aspects of war production, from distributing raw materials to setting prices for manufactured goods. And it created standardized specifications for nearly everything. The Railroad Administration controlled the nation's transportation. The Fuel Agency rationed coal and oil. And the Food Administration, directed by Herbert Hoover, helped farmers increase crop yields and promoted more efficient food preparation. These agencies generally saw themselves as friends to business as much as regulators of it, and they guaranteed government contractors a high rate of profit and encouraged cooperation among businesses by suspending antitrust laws. The War Labor Board, however, included representatives of government, industry, and the AFL, and instituted in some industries a minimum wage, an 8-hour workday, and protections for unions. Wages rose significantly in the war, working conditions improved in many places, and union membership doubled. Corporate and income taxes soared. By 1918, the wealthiest Americans were paying 60% of their income in taxes, and millions of Americans purchased Liberty bonds. With peace, this wartime state rapidly dissolved, but it momentarily gave progressives hope that government could rationalize the economy and society for the sake of justice and national purpose. All combatants issued propaganda posters. This American poster, part of a 1917 campaign to sell war bonds, depicts a militarized Statue of Liberty about to take a sword from a kneeling Boy Scout. This German poster, satirically entitled "We Are Barbarians," refutes the charge of barbarism hurled at Germans by the Allies. It relates that Germany outstrips England and France in Nobel Prizes, provision for the elderly, book publication, education, and literacy. Many Americans doubted whether America should intervene in a struggle between rival empires. Many outright opposed American entry into the war, as did groups such as the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, and much of the Socialist Party. In April 1917, to counteract anti-war sentiment, Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, CPI, directed by George Creel, to run a campaign to build support for the war. The CPI enlisted academics, journalists, artists, and advertisers to flood the nation with pro-war propaganda, from posters to movies. The agency trained and sent across the nation 75,000 four-minute men to deliver brief and standardized talks, sometimes in immigrant languages, to audiences at schools and movie theaters. The federal government had never before had an agency dedicated to manipulating public opinion, and future administrations mounted similar campaigns during World War II, the Cold War, and conflicts in Iraq. The administration and the CPI made its appeal in a progressive language of social cooperation and expanded democracy. This meant a peace based on national self-determination abroad and industrial democracy at home. The CPI tried to sell the war to workers as a fight for democracy by promising the 8-hour workday after the war. Freedom was also a key term in the mobilization, and the CPI argued that the war was being fought for the great cause of freedom. The Statue of Liberty was a common image in wartime propaganda and was used in particular to rally immigrants. Buying Liberty bonds became a way to demonstrate patriotism. The German Kaiser and the German nation and people were defined as the antithesis of freedom and depicted as barbaric Huns. Douglas Fairbanks, one of the era's most celebrated movie stars, addressing a 1918 rally urging people to buy Liberty bonds. A Navy recruiting poster from World War I. A different outlook was expressed by the Irish writer Oscar Wilde, who once quipped, "Any fool can make history. It takes a genius to write it." The use of the words democracy and freedom as ideological weapons of war inevitably sparked demands for their expansion at home. In 1916, Wilson seemed to endorse women's suffrage. But the war threatened to splinter the movement, as many in it opposed American intervention. Even the first woman in Congress, Jeannette Rankin of Montana, voted against American entry into the war. But most suffrage movement leaders and most women supported and participated in war mobilization, selling bonds, organizing patriotic rallies, and working in war production. A new and more militant generation of women activists, organized in the National Women's Party, pushed for suffrage with tactics that scandalized older women activists, such as civil disobedience and demonstrations in front of the White House. Led by Alice Paul, these tactics, coupled with wartime service, pressured the White House to fully endorse woman suffrage, and in 1920, the 19th Amendment, barring any state from using sex as a qualification for suffrage, was ratified. The United States became the 27th country to allow women to vote. The war also enhanced other women reformers' campaigns, especially prohibition. Several factors helped finally to secure the prohibition of sale of liquor nationwide, including employers' interest in a more disciplined labor force, urban reformers who wanted orderly cities and to dismantle political machines that used saloons, and women reformers who wanted to protect wives and children from domestic abuse and the squandering of men's wages for alcohol. Many native-born Protestants sought prohibition as a means to Americanize immigrants. Prohibitionists first focused on state campaigns, which were successful in more than a dozen states, but the war made beer, often brewed by German Americans, unpopular. In December 1917, Congress passed the 18th Amendment, prohibiting the manufacture and sale of liquors, which took effect in 1920. Women during World War I. 2 women hauling ice, a job confined to men before the war. Women during World War I. Woman suffrage demonstrators in front of the White House. A 1915 cartoon showing the Western states where women had won the right to vote. Women in the East reach out to a Western woman carrying a torch of liberty. This is a 1916 cartoon from the publication of the Woman's Christian Temperance Union. It shows petitions for prohibition flooding into Congress. In the early years of the 20th century, many states and localities in the South and West banned the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. Wet counties allowed alcoholic beverages. Dry counties banned them. Prohibition became national with the adoption of the 18th Amendment in 1919. The war showed that, during a conflict, civil liberties are often imperiled. Randolph Bourne in 1917 warned progressives that they would not be able to manipulate the war for their own liberal purposes, and that instead, the war would empower the least democratic forces in American life. Despite the Wilson administration's idealistic rhetoric, the war initiated the most extreme repression of civil liberties in American history. In the eyes of Wilson and his supporters, American goals were so virtuous that disagreement reflected treason. For the first time since the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, the federal government enacted laws to restrict freedom of speech. The Espionage Act of 1917 prohibited not only spying and interfering with the draft, but also false statements that might impede military success. In 1918, the Sedition Act made it a crime to make spoken or printed statements that intended to cast contempt, scorn, or disrepute on the form of government, or that advocated interference with the war effort. The most prominent victim was Eugene V. Debs, convicted in 1918 under the Espionage Act for delivering an anti-war speech to 10 years in prison. Debs ran for president while still in prison in 1920 and received 900,000 votes. It was left to Wilson's successor, Warren G. Harding, to release Debs from prison in 1921. More extreme repression was implemented by state government and private groups. Many states imprisoned those critical of the American flag, outlawed the possession of red and black flags, symbolizing communism and anarchism, and 23 states passed criminal syndicalism laws, making it illegal to advocate political change through unlawful acts, or a change in industrial ownership. Patriotism came to be synonymous with support for the government, the war, and the American economic system, while anti-war sentiment, labor radicalism, and sympathy for the Russian Revolution became un-American. Local authorities investigated residents who did not buy Liberty loans. Schools revised their curriculum to ensure its patriotism and required teachers to sign loyalty oaths. The 250,000 members of the American Protective League helped the Justice Department identify radicals and critics of the war by spying on neighbors and carrying out slacker raids, stopping thousands of men in major cities and requiring them to produce draft cards. Private groups used the war as an opportunity to attack their enemies, as was the case with the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, whose members were attacked, some killed, and whose leadership was arrested. Even though some progressives protested individual incidents, most progressives did not challenge the general atmosphere of repression. A 1917 anti-war cartoon from the radical magazine The Masses depicts an editor, capitalist, politician, and minister celebrating American involvement in World War I and hoping to benefit from it. The Wilson administration banned The Masses and other anti-war publications from the mails. A common patriotic exercise involved massive numbers of soldiers forming images of the Statue of Liberty, the Liberty Bell, or President Woodrow Wilson. Here, in 1918, some 18,000 men about to depart for the war in Europe from Camp Dodge, Iowa, create what contemporaries call a living photograph. A poster demands that citizens prove they are 100% American by purchasing war bonds. Florian Stettheimer's New York Liberty, painted in 1918, depicts the Statue of Liberty, warships and airplanes in an exuberant tribute to New York City and to the idea of freedom in the wake of World War I. A long line of striking miners being led out of Bisbee, Arizona in July 1917. Some 1,200 members of the Industrial Workers of the World were transported into the desert by armed vigilantes and abandoned there. Progressivism anticipated, in many ways, major 20th century developments, including the New Deal, the Great Society, and the socially active state. But by accepting race as a permanent and defining characteristic of individuals and groups, progressives were more like 19th century thinkers than 20th century liberals. What was called the race problem was a major subject of debate before World War I, and it referred to more than just relations between blacks and whites. In 1911, the U.S. Immigration Commission listed in one of its publications 45 different immigrant races, each with its own alleged innate characteristics, ranging from Anglo-Saxons at the top of the racial hierarchy down to Hebrews, Northern Italians, and at the bottom, Southern Italians, those apparently the most violent, undisciplined, and incapable of assimilation. Popular writers asserted that the wave of new immigration and white women's declining birth rate threatened American civilization. The emergence of eugenics, which studied the alleged mental characteristics of different groups of people, gave an air of scientific expertise to anti-immigrant sentiment. Racial purity became an obsession of eugenicists. Eugenics taught that since many social problems, including juvenile delinquency, prostitution, and even poverty, were caused by defective genes, they could be eliminated by controlling reproduction. This belief that these problems could be solved by actively shaping the nation's population encouraged efforts to restrict immigration. The war accelerated other efforts to improve the quality of the American people. In Buck v. Bell, 1927, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of sterilization laws. Carrie Buck, an 18-year-old inmate at a Virginia mental institution, sued to prevent her sterilization by the state on the grounds that it violated her right to the equal protection of the laws, guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's opinion rejecting her plea included the widely publicized statement, "Society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." By the time the practice ended in the 1960s, some 63,000 people had been involuntarily sterilized. American eugenics policies for manipulating the character of the population were carefully studied in Nazi Germany. The nationalization of politics and the economy seemed to elevate consciousness of ethnic and racial difference and caused some to call for Americanization, the creation of a more homogeneous national culture. A 1908 play, The Melting Pot, gave a popular name to the process by which immigrants were expected to merge their identity with American nationality. Public and private leaders, including teachers, employers, union leaders, social reformers, and public officials, were all engaged in Americanization efforts. The Ford Motor Company famously created a sociological department that entered immigrant workers' homes to examine their clothes, furniture, and food, enrolled them in English language courses, and fired those who failed to Americanize themselves. Public education was an important vehicle for instructing immigrant children. A few progressives criticized Americanization and demanded that Americans respect immigrant cultures. Reformers at Hull House encouraged immigrants to value their European backgrounds, and Randolph Bourne wrote in a 1916 essay, Transnational America, that there was no distinctive American culture. However, those born outside of the United States were viewed with suspicion and went through great lengths to prove their loyalty to the United States. Some ethnic leaders who faced pre-war discrimination saw the war as an opportunity to gain greater rights through expressions of loyalty. German Americans bore the brunt of forced Americanization. The first wave of German immigrants had arrived before the Civil War. By 1914, German Americans numbered nearly 9 million, including immigrants and persons of German parentage. On the eve of the war, many Americans admired German traditions. But after American entry into the war, the use of German and expressions of German culture became a target of pro-war organizations. The war dealt a crushing blow to German American culture. Even as Americanization programs sought to assimilate immigrants into American society, the war strengthened the conviction that certain kinds of undesirable persons ought to be excluded altogether. The new immigrants, one advocate of restriction declared, appreciated the values of democracy and freedom far less than the Anglo-Saxon, as evidenced by their attraction to extreme political doctrines like anarchism and socialism. Stanford University psychologist Lewis Terman introduced the term IQ, intelligence quotient, in 1916, claiming that this single number could measure an individual's mental capacity. Intelligence tests administered to recruits by the Army seemed to confirm scientifically that blacks and the new immigrants stood far below native white Protestants on the IQ scale, further spurring demands for immigration restriction. Local police with literature seized from a Communist Party office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, November 1919. This is an image of an Americanization celebration, a photograph of a Catholic assembly on National Slavic Day, September 3, 1914, and it illustrates how immigrants strove to demonstrate their patriotism. Children wear Old World dress, but most of the adults are in American clothing or nurses' uniforms. This is a vivid example of the anti-war German propaganda produced by the federal government to encourage pro-war sentiment during World War I. Americanization assumed that European immigrants, and especially their children, could eventually adjust to American life, adopt American ideals, and become citizens who enjoyed American freedoms. This assumption did not apply to non-white immigrants or blacks who faced persistent exclusion. Wartime labor demands increased the immigration of Mexicans who were exempted from 1917 literacy rules. But though Mexicans were legally considered white, state and local officials in the Southwest discriminated against Mexicans in a system of segregation that affected schools, hospitals, and theaters, not unlike Jim Crow in the South. Although Congress conferred citizenship on Puerto Ricans on the eve of World War I, and Puerto Rican men became subject to the draft and served in the war, Puerto Ricans were still not allowed to vote for president or have representation in Congress. Most restrictive were policies toward Asian Americans. In 1907, Roosevelt negotiated a gentleman's agreement in which Japan agreed to end further Japanese migration, except for the wives and children of men already in the country. In 1913, California banned all aliens incapable of becoming naturalized citizens, for example, Asians, from owning or leasing land. This is a 1919 cartoon. Close the Gate warns that unrestricted immigration allows dangerous radicals to enter the United States. African Americans, members of the largest non-white group in America, were excluded from almost all progressive ideas of freedom. They were disenfranchised in the South, barred from most unions and skilled jobs. Most black women worked outside of the home for low wages in jobs not covered by new state-level protections for working women. And most blacks, who were desperately poor, could not participate in the new consumer economy. Nearly all progressive intellectuals, social scientists, labor reformers, and suffrage advocates were unconcerned by conditions facing black Americans. The progressive presidents shared dominant racial attitudes regarding blacks. Theodore Roosevelt's celebration of Anglo-Saxon supremacy led him to call Indians savages and state that blacks were unfit to exercise the suffrage. Not even Jane Addams, a supporter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, resisted the abandonment of civil rights plank in the 1912 Progressive Party platform. Woodrow Wilson, a Virginia native, celebrated the South's genuine representative government. He imposed racial segregation in federal agencies in Washington, D.C., fired black federal employees, and screened at the White House the premiere of Birth of a Nation, a film glorifying the Ku Klux Klan as having defended white civilization during Reconstruction. African Americans understandably remained skeptical of the nation's claim of freedom. This is a poster advertising the 1915 film The Birth of a Nation, which had its premiere at Woodrow Wilson's White House. The movie glorified the Ku Klux Klan and depicted blacks during Reconstruction as unworthy of participation in government and a danger to white womanhood. This is a cartoon from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, April 17, 1906, commenting on the lynching of 3 black men in Springfield, Missouri. The shadow cast by the Statue of Liberty forms a gallows on the ground. Black leaders in this period tried to renew America's Reconstruction-era commitment to racial equality. No other leader did more to renew the movement for black freedom than scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, a Massachusetts native and Harvard graduate. In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, he called on blacks to reject the accommodationism of Booker T. Washington. Du Bois believed that educated African Americans like himself were a talented tenth who could use their education and talent to fight inequality. In 1905, Du Bois gathered black leaders at Niagara Falls in Canada and launched the Niagara Movement, which demanded the restoration of black rights to vote, an end to segregation, and complete equality in economic and educational opportunities. The agenda of black struggles for racial justice for the rest of the 20th century. In 1909, Du Bois joined with mostly white reformers to organize the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which launched a legal strategy to win the enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments that at first accomplished little. Overall, the Progressive Era saw virtually no progress toward racial justice. Among Black Americans, wartime talk of freedom sparked hopes for radical changes in race relations. Most Black leaders saw American participation in the war as an opportunity to win freedom for Blacks at home. Du Bois himself called on African Americans to close ranks and enlist in the Army, believing that Blacks' sacrifices would earn them rights upon returning to America. But this did not happen, as the Navy barred Blacks entirely, and the segregated Army assigned most of the 400,000 Black soldiers who served to supply units rather than combat. African American soldiers were treated as equals by French civilians, which the U.S. Army protested. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, founder of the NAACP and editor of its magazine, The Crisis, in his New York office. The men who founded the Niagara Movement at a 1905 meeting on the Canadian side of the Niagara Falls. W.E.B. Du Bois is in the second row, second from the right, in a white hat. They pledged to renew the struggle for every single right that belongs to a free-born American. By the time of the second meeting, a year later, women had become part of the movement. This is a piece of sheet music from 1919. The cover illustration suggests that because they fought side by side with white soldiers in World War I, although in fact the Army was racially segregated, Black soldiers deserved legal equality on their return to the United States. Unfortunately, they did not receive it. The war sparked social changes that transformed American race relations. Increased war production and a sharp decline in European immigration made available thousands of industrial jobs to Blacks for the first time, inspiring a mass migration from the South to the North. When the war began, 90% of American Blacks lived in the South, and most northern cities had small Black populations. Between 1910 and 1920, 500,000 Blacks left the South, moving to large cities like New York and Chicago, and smaller cities such as Akron, Buffalo, and Trenton. The desire for work and higher wages, education, an escape from the threat of violence, and the vote motivated African Americans to participate in the Great Migration. Yet these migrants encountered considerable disappointments, including limited employment opportunities, exclusion from unions, housing segregation, and outbreaks of violence. Dozens of Blacks were killed in a 1917 riot in East St. Louis, Illinois, where Blacks had been recruited to weaken unions. In 1919, more than 250 people died in riots in northern cities, most notably in Chicago. But racial violence also exploded in the South, where, in the year after the war, dozens were lynched, including Black veterans who wore their uniforms, and striking Black sharecroppers were massacred by white vigilantes. The worst race riot in American history occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where more than 300 Blacks were killed and thousands made homeless by a white mob, including the police and National Guard. after black veterans tried to prevent the lynching of a youth who had accidentally tripped and fallen on a white female elevator operator, sparking rumors of rape. Racial violence during the war inspired a new spirit of militancy among African Americans. In northern cities, many blacks supported the Universal Negro Improvement Association, a movement for African independence and black self-reliance launched by Marcus Garvey, a recent immigrant from Jamaica. The Garveyites' idea of freedom was self-determination for blacks, who should enjoy the same international recognition as a nation as other peoples after the war. While Du Bois and other black leaders viewed Garvey as a dangerous demagogue and welcomed Garvey's deportation after his conviction for mail fraud, the Garveyite movement demonstrated blacks' sense of betrayal in the post-war period. One of a series of paintings by the black artist Jacob Lawrence called the Migration Series, inspired by the massive movement of African Americans to the North during and after World War I. For each, Lawrence composed a brief title, in this case, "In the North, the Negro had better educational facilities." Buildings in Tulsa, Oklahoma burned during the city's riot of June 1921. An estimated 300 people died when white mobs destroyed the city's black neighborhood in the worst outbreak of racial violence in American history. This is Marcus Garvey. He was the leader of the largest black movement of the World War I era. Fervent hopes for social change and disappointment with the war's aftermath went beyond the black community. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union as Russia was renamed after the revolution, Lenin's government nationalized landholdings, banks, and factories, and was proclaimed a worker state. The Russian Revolution and democratic longings unleashed by World War I sent hope and fear throughout the world. The year 1919, like 1848 and 1968, was a year of global social and political unrest. Inspired by Lenin's call for revolution, communist-led governments came to power in Bavaria, part of Germany and Hungary, and general strikes demanding wartime promises of industrial democracy shook Belfast, Glasgow, and Winnipeg. Anarchist peasants seized land in Spain, and Indian crowds challenged British imperial rule, as did nationalist movements in other European colonies. Opponents to change mobilized, including the Allied powers, who saw the Soviet government as a threat and sent expeditionary forces that included American troops to aid Lenin's opponents in the Russian Civil War. Wilson's policy toward the Soviet Union showed the contradictions of liberal internationalism. Wilson wanted to foster trade with the new government, but his fear of communism as a source of international instability and a danger to private property led him to military intervention. The Allies did not invite the Soviets to peace talks at Versailles, and Wilson refused to recognize the Soviet government. Anti-communism remained a basic feature of 20th century U.S. foreign policy. The year 1919 also saw enormous turmoil in America. Amid racial violence and a devastating flu epidemic, a bombing campaign targeted the homes of prominent Americans. More significant was an upsurge in the labor movement, as workers took Wilson's promises of industrial democracy and freedom seriously. In 1919, more than 4 million workers went on strike, creating the greatest wave of labor unrest in U.S. history. They faced an unprecedented mobilization of employers, government, and private patriotic organizations. The strike wave began in January in Seattle, where a shipyard workers' strike became a general strike that paralyzed the city. In September, Boston police went on strike, and Governor Calvin Coolidge fired the entire force and called out the National Guard. A massive coal strike was ended only by a federal injunction. The 1919 steel strike was the era's greatest labor revolt. Centered in Chicago, it brought together 365,000 mostly immigrant workers who demanded union recognition, higher wages, and an 8-hour workday in an industry that arbitrarily established wages and working conditions and suppressed all union activity. During the war, large numbers of workers joined the Steelworkers Union, and by the end of 1918, they had won the 8-hour day. But employers resumed opposing the union after the war, and they responded to the strike by appealing to nativism among native-born workers, many of whom returned to work, and by painting the union and strike as inspired by the IWW, communism, and disloyalty. Public opinion's turn against the strikers, along with police attacks, led to the strike's defeat in early 1920. Though many progressives hoped wartime economic planning would continue after 1918, the Wilson administration rapidly dismantled agencies that controlled industrial production and the labor market. Yet the wartime repression of dissent persisted and peaked in the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, which was inflamed by the post-war strike wave and social tensions and fears caused by the Russian Revolution. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, certain that the steel strike was part of a global communist conspiracy, ordered federal raids on radical and labor organizations led by the young director of the Radical Division of the Justice Department, J. Edgar Hoover. More than 5,000 were arrested, most without warrants, and held for months without charge. The government deported hundreds of immigrant radicals, including Emma Goldman. This assault on civil liberties was so extreme that heavy criticism was leveled at Palmer by Congress and the press, and the scare dissolved. Though it generated a new concern for civil liberties in the 1920s, the Red Scare successfully destroyed radical groups such as the IWW and the Socialist Party. This is an advertisement placed by a steel company in a Pittsburgh newspaper, and it announces, in several languages, that the steel strike of 1919 has failed. The use of the figure of Uncle Sam illustrates how the companies clothed their anti-union stance in the language of patriotism. Wilson's failure to gain a just peace at Versailles based on his 14 points exacerbated many progressives' sense that the war would not fundamentally transform society and government. In late 1918, Wilson traveled to France for the Versailles Peace Conference and was welcomed by ordinary Europeans as a hero. But while Wilson's 14 points had called for open diplomacy, the Versailles talks were held in secret. The Versailles Treaty did accomplish some of Wilson's hopes, including the establishment of a League of Nations to supervise a new international order, and it applied national self-determination to Eastern Europe, making new nations from the ruins of the defeated Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany. But despite Wilson's opposition to a peace based on territorial acquisition or revenge, the Versailles Treaty included both, virtually guaranteeing future conflict. France won the right to occupy iron and coal-rich regions of Germany. Strict limits were imposed on Germany's future army and navy, and Germany was required to make reparations payments that were so high that they devastated the German economy. The war damaged Europeans' claims to be a higher civilization with the right to rule lesser peoples and elevated the international prestige of the United States. Wilson's language of self-determination inspired minority groups and colonial peoples across the world, but they took this rhetoric more seriously than he did. Wilson's idea of an equality of nations clashed with Europeans' rulers' wishes to rebuild their empires in the post-war period. They rejected the appeals of colonial figures for independence, such as Nguyen That Thanh, the future Ho Chi Minh, who went to Versailles to ask for freedom from French colonial rule. The British and French had no intention of applying self-determination to their colonies. The Ottoman Empire was divided into nations such as Syria, Iraq, and Palestine, over which the British and French were given mandates to govern. Former German colonies in Africa were given to South Africa, Australia, and Japan, and Ireland was not given its independence. This is part of the crowd that greeted President Woodrow Wilson in November 1918 when he traveled to Paris to take part in the peace conference. An electric sign proclaims, "Long live Wilson." World War I and the Versailles Treaty redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires ceased to exist, and Germany and Russia were reduced in size. A group of new states emerged in Eastern Europe, embodying the principle of self-determination, one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Widespread disappointment among colonial peoples that the 14 points had not been applied to non-European world created cynicism regarding the West's language of freedom and democracy. Wilson's apparent capitulation to the claims of European empires sparked popular anti-Western nationalist movements across the world, including the May 4th movement in China and the communist movement in Vietnam led by Ho Chi Minh. Lenin, in fact, spoke of the rights of nations to self-determination before Wilson, and with the end of the Wilsonian movement, Lenin's reputation supplanted that of America's president. These movements, whether or not they were communist, signaled the emergence of anti-colonial nationalism as a major force in the 20th century. Ironically, when colonial peoples demanded to be recognized as independent members of the international community, they invoked the legacy of the American Revolution as the first colonial struggle to establish an independent nation, and Wilson's language of self-governing and equal nation states as the most legitimate form of government and world order. Wilson, upon returning to the United States from Versailles, saw the League of Nations as the war's most important legacy. But many Americans feared that League membership would force the United States into open-ended commitments in the affairs of other nations. Wilson argued that the United States could not save the world without being continually involved with it. His opponents, led by Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, argued the League would limit America's freedom of action. Wilson refused to compromise, and in the midst of the League debate, he suffered a massive stroke that left him incapacitated. His wife Edith effectively assumed his office for 17 months. The Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty twice. In the war's immediate aftermath, the United States retreated from international affairs. Over the long term, however, Wilson's idealism and power politics shaped the fundamentals of American foreign policy in the 20th century. A commitment to democracy, open markets, and trade, America's special mission to instruct the world in freedom, and the will for military intervention abroad to promote American interests and values. But the war had not made the world safe or democratic. It undermined freedom in the United States, and it led to the defeat of progressivism. Republican Warren G. Harding, part of the party's conservative wing and elected president in 1920, repudiated Wilsonism and promised a return to normalcy, thus inaugurating one of the most conservative decades in the nation's history. Mahatma Gandhi, pictured here in 1919, became the leader of the nonviolent movement for independence in India. He was among those disappointed by the failure of the Versailles Peace Conference to apply the principle of self-determination to the colonial world. This is Interrupting the Ceremony, a 1918 cartoon from the Chicago Tribune. It depicts Senate opponents of the Versailles Treaty arriving just in time to prevent the United States from becoming permanently ensnared in foreign entanglements through the League of Nations.